Hello and welcome to another episode of Dark Souls II Dissected. Today we're going out of bounds to find all the weird stuff that's hidden backstage. This is an episode I've been looking forward to for a while now, and so I hope you'll enjoy this exploration of the weird stuff in Drangleic. Before we begin, I'd like to quickly give some context to some of what we're about to be looking at. Dark Souls II is known for having a troubled development that resulted in a change of director midway through, and due to time constraints, they had to salvage and reuse a lot of partially completed content instead of being able to start over from scratch. This means that a lot of the maps were originally designed without knowing how they were going to fit into the game, and they had to find a way to cram them together. You'll find some vestigial elements of unused paths and changes to the environment in other Souls games as well, but it happened to a much greater degree in Dark Souls 2. I'll have more to say about the world layout and map placements in a future video, but today's episode will help lay some groundwork by demonstrating that, yeah, there's a lot of evidence of them experimenting with the maps that can be found out of bounds. So with that being said, let's get started. Let's begin by jumping right into what I consider the most interesting area, the Shaded Woods. You might not expect much from an area that's largely just a mundane crossroads to other locations, but being what it is, it comes as no surprise that a lot of the experimentation with figuring out how to connect maps will be found here. To start with, there's something hiding behind the rubble here. It's a pit of some kind. By going out of bounds, we can get an appreciation for how big it is. Now, whether or not this was meant to lead anywhere is unclear. Maybe it was just meant as a random detail for the environment, but you can't really get a good vantage point from anywhere. This is the most you can see of it, normally. If it is just a random set detail, maybe it's like a pit for these enemies to dispose things in, but that's not really communicated in any way from the environmental design. Given the steepness of it, I wonder if it was something you could have fallen into, and maybe you would have slid down without being able to climb back out. With subterranean areas like the Grave of Saints in mind, I think it could have made for a connecting path to somewhere like that. Though bear in mind I don't have any direct evidence of this, it's just speculation. Either way, they tried pretty hard to make sure you can't wind up back there in the end, as there's a very tall, invisible wall blocking it. On the subject of weird pits, I'd like to point out something that almost went into my Dark Souls 1 video. It's not exactly out of bounds, but I think a lot of players might not notice that the weird cylindrical structure by the exit of Quelaag's arena is also a pit. It doesn't lead anywhere in particular, but it's also just a really odd detail that you can't see very clearly. I wonder if the original intention was to have Quelaag crawl up from there instead of just walking down the steps in her cutscene, or if it just implies some way of getting down to interact with her sister or something. Anyways, back to Dark Souls 2. We don't have to go very far from here to find other things that are definitely unused paths. Flying out of bounds over in this direction reveals a walkway of some kind. A decent chunk of it is exposed to open air, but it takes you through this one spot and then leads somewhere more cavernous. If we go outside the far end, we can see it doesn't really lead anywhere in particular. Taking a closer look at that spot in the middle shows us something kind of interesting. There's a path leading up to a weird bowl-like structure of some kind. Though the material doesn't look anything quite like a nest, the basic shape of it makes me wonder if it might possibly be a low-quality LOD of one. It's another complete guess, but using Dark Souls 1 as a reference again, we know that they were experimenting with having the crow used in different situations, so it makes me wonder if the same happened in Dark Souls 2. And not far from here is another unused path. This is another walkway that's also fairly high above most of the rest of the level. It features a straight path with one little nook on the right-hand side, and it leads to another dead-end opening. But we can get this area to load from another vantage point. When we go up to this area, you might notice some low-quality trees in the distance. Being up here actually winds up adding trees to this unused path, so it provides just a little bit more detail, which is cool to see. There's even more evidence of alternate pathing in this area, but it involves cut content instead of out-of-bounds content, so I'll save a closer look for a future video. But the short version is that I suspect that the viaduct might have been intended to lead directly to Drangleic Castle at some point. But like I said, there's nothing to directly show this by simply going out of bounds. Here's a look at more unused paths found throughout the game. The Undead Purgatory in the Huntsman's Copse has an unused entrance hiding around the side of it. It's interesting because it has a unique asset here, a sort of tent entrance of some kind. It leads into an inaccessible part of the Outer Ring. I think it seems to indicate some possible alternate pathing into the area entirely, as the landmass it's connected to leads directly towards a wall here. It's kind of suspicious having a walkway that leads towards nothing, so I wonder if a path was intended to be here previously. Hidden completely underneath the ground nearby, we can find some giant boulders as well. You can find similar boulders elsewhere in the game, sticking partially out of the ground, so I think these were going to be placed here to add some detail, but of course the idea was abandoned at some point. Over in Brightstone Cove Seldora, above the Chapel Threshold bonfire, we can see an outcropping of rocks that ascend upwards like a staircase. If we follow that up, we'll find a doorway that points towards the valley. It doesn't lead anywhere, and ultimately it's just hidden behind the wall of rock there. And if we go further up still, we find another doorway. This one is more closely aligned with some unreachable set pieces out here. Special thanks to Stade for pointing these doorways out to me. If you're not already familiar with their work, they're in the process of making an insane overhaul to the visuals of Dark Souls II. Not only lighting and particle effect changes, but even 3D assets in the environment. You can see updates to that ongoing project if you follow Stade on Twitter, @Stade3D. Here's something else we can find nearby. If we go down to the far end from the sand pit, we can go up and find the nook where the spiders crawl down from. If we turn around, we can find a hidden doorway to an unused room. It contains this shaft, which appears to possibly be an elevator shaft. If we follow it up, we can see it has an exit at the top as well. All we get to see of this normally in-game is this exposed section of the shaft from down by the pit. If you wanted to see what was further out in this direction, well, sadly there's not much out here. And one of the stranger curiosities I found was something in the earthen peak. In the collision map viewer, I found what appeared to be a room floating by itself off in the distance. This was particularly interesting to me because most of this out-of-bounds junk lacks collision and can't be found in the viewer. I tried to locate it in-game, but found nothing I could see out there. At first, the displayed coordinates on the NoClip website didn't seem to help me locate it, but then I realized that dividing those coordinates by 20 would give us the numbers that we needed to punch into Cheat Engine to teleport there. I was hoping I could make contact with the collision to see this room, but instead, this happens. So the room sadly does not appear to have a remaining visual component, but its collision for whatever reason de-renders most of the rest of the level and only renders the room outside Mythos Arena. I proceeded to drop a bunch of prism stones on it to help visualize it somewhat. What was the purpose of this room and why is it all the way out here is anyone's guess. Okay, let's take a look at some things in Majula. One of the first really cool out-of-bounds discoveries in this game was the Lord Vessel from Dark Souls I. In the mansion's basement, you'll find shards of the Broken Lord vessel, while an intact one can be found above the ceiling nearby. Credit to Master Axon on Reddit for sharing this with the community all those years back. They'd also pointed out how you can see more to the world map, but it's just repeating parts you can already see normally. Something I recently found was another curious remnant of a discarded path. It loads when you enter the rotunda, so you have to go out of bounds from there. In the distance you'll find this weird sort of box of geography. It has an entrance to it, and it contains a cave path inside. I tried to determine if it was something like an incomplete LOD of an already existing path in an upcoming area, but revisiting those coordinates when the Huntsman's Copse is loaded puts us out here. And checking the same coordinates from the Earthen Peak puts us over here. So yeah, it does appear to just be a random piece of floating cave that's not used anywhere else. I alluded to some cut content earlier, and what I was talking about was how Dark Souls 2 has a bunch of unused map pieces. I'm not going to go into all of that here since there's so much of it, and that should be its own discussion. But I just wanted to quickly point out how, with that content restored, we see another similar set piece out here beyond the normal out of bounds one. Okay, so let's make sense of some of the distant views in the skyboxes. Over in this direction, we have the Forest of Fallen Giants. The land it resides on is 3-dimensional, but the buildings set on top are 2-dimensional. They're layered and angled, so it's not all perfectly flat, but it's still a series of cardboard cutouts, essentially. We can recognize some familiar elements out here. Let's start with the structure on the right. This is the Cardinal Tower, which is the building that houses that main sort of bonfire. If it doesn't look too familiar from this angle, we can recreate that angle by positioning ourselves nearby, out of bounds. We see a darker patch on the top right of the building, which represents the tree leaves here. We see the branches climbing up the side of the building, and over to the right we see the walkway with the rubble on top of it. The tower's placement next to this other structure is kind of legit, which is cool to see. This giant statue is the same one that we see after the Pursuer boss fight by the Bird's Nest. We get to see the backside from Majula, which we don't normally get to see from anywhere up close. But we can explore the backside here to take another look, and we can see that it is fully textured from here. And going further out can help clarify its positioning relative to Cardinal Tower. Okay, I know we still have more things to look at in Majula, but while we're out here, we might as well take a look at the nearby parts of the environment we aren't meant to reach. There's a surprising amount of detail to the rubble back here. We have a roof that's collapsed, with a room underneath it, and that room has walls textured on all sides. And we also have the broken tower over here. Back to Majula. Looking again at the Forest of Fallen Giants skybox, there's something of interest in one of the layers that's further back. At the bottom of it, we see something strange. We see two sets of whatever that is, among some otherwise generic trees and mountains. I was trying to figure out what they meant to convey with that, until I recognized that it looked a lot like the top of the first tower near the first bonfire. It doesn't really make sense, since it puts it really far from the other structures here, but you also can't see it from anywhere in bounds normally anyways, so it seems kind of like a discarded experiment in trying to represent the Forest of Fallen Giants from a distance. Okay, so turning around completely, we can see Heide's Tower of Flame. Once again, the distance is exaggerated from its actual location. Up close we can see it's a 2D texture that's angled back a bit. It is comprised of actual elements of the level, arranged in the way that we would expect. We find the Tower of Flame off to the right, and the Cathedral of Blue, where you fight the old Dragon Slayer, on the left. We can also look at the various ruins lining the hilltops straight ahead. There are some segments of walls out here, and some loose columns. There's also some specific scenery we can recognize. We have this round building, which represents the round building just around the corner by Benhart of Hugo. Further straight back, we have the viaduct that runs through the shaded woods. And we also have a 2D representation of Drangleic Castle. But perhaps the most interesting thing to me back here is this particular structure that's off to the right. It's not just more random walls like the other pieces nearby, but it's a direct copy of the set piece that contains the Shaded Ruins bonfire. We can see that it's shaped the same, and it also includes the window space on the backside near the bonfire. Lastly, something else we can only see if we go out of bounds is something hiding beyond and to the left of the Forest of Fallen Giants. Way back here, there's another building of some kind. My theory is that it's meant to be the Undead Crypt, but that's a subject of discussion for the world layout video I'll do later on. As the game progresses, the game starts to make less and less of an effort to telegraph upcoming or previous areas. Apart from the shaded woods, including Drangleic Castle in the distance, Heide's Tower of Flame is one of the few locations we can look back and see a meaningful amount of distant stuff. We can see the monument from Majula and the Forest of Fallen Giants behind us. Here's a closer look at the monument. And here's the Forest of Fallen Giants once again. We see the same textures used for the buildings here, although the surrounding skybox and distant terrain is different than its depiction from Majula. And something a bit odd here, but there's a square void in the sea not far from the Majula monument. It's normally hidden behind the cliff wall here. We can use the collision map viewer to find the true locations of the Blue Sentinels arenas, and we find that they're not far off from the rear of the cathedral. Flying around out there will allow us to hit their collision and get them to load. I find this particular arena to be the most interesting. It's surrounded by these massive bird people statues. You can barely see these at all from inside the bounds of the arena. Although to be fair, you do get to see them elsewhere in the level, just much smaller versions. We can also take a closer look at some of the ruins in the distance. I'd assume it's meant to just be more ruins of Heide, but these further two-dimensional pieces of architecture don't fully match the look or feel of Heide, so I'm not entirely sure. Heide's Tower of Flame is one of the more majestic areas in the Souls games, so let's take a moment to appreciate a few more things we can't normally get a close look at. So we just recently saw the 2D version of Drangleic Castle from Majula, but how do other distant views stack up? We find that, even though it's incredibly distant from the Forest of Fallen Giants, it is represented with a 3D model instead. The same also goes for its representation from the Shaded Woods, using what appears to be the same model used from the forest, but this time with different textures. We can also take a closer look at the Lost Bastille from No Man's Wharf. It's normally too distant and too dark to notice this, but getting closer and increasing the brightness reveals that they reused the distant Forest of Fallen Giants to save on time. The Cardinal Tower is moved to the center, and it just has the branchwork and path to its right removed. And the outer wall that normally has the giant statue behind it is still up front here as well, just with the giant statue missing. They pretty much just added these towers in the corners to make it distinct. I also wanted to take a closer look at the memory of Jay. We can take a look at the warships down below, which are kind of neat to see up close. By going under the water, we can see how the ships bob up and down. And we can take a closer look at the flag to see that it's the Drangleic insignia. And here's a different angle of the giant statue having its head blown off. I also found that traveling through the level can cause the other memories to load if you make contact with their collision. And I wanted to capture what happens when you burn the windmills on the earthen peak from another perspective. So here's a look at that. Here's something kind of odd in the Huntsman's Copse. Inside that first building with the pit, if you've ever fallen in, you might have noticed that it slopes and curves as it kills you. It's not a straight drop down. Going out of bounds reveals the shape of the pit, and it's pretty odd to see that they bothered curving it like this. It has a proper exit in the environment, a large hole in the cliffside wall. You actually can see it even without going out of bounds, but probably very few actually see or notice it. And let's take a closer look at the arena inside the Undead Purgatory. You can see some similar stuff hanging above, like you see inside the various arenas. But what's actually in there is an interior similar to the one with the platform in the center. Only that's all that's in here. And just like the Blue Sentinels arenas, the collision map viewer reveals their true location if you wanted to try and clip into them to make them spawn. Here's something you can do to get a clearer look at frozen Ilium Lois. You can change the fog density to 0 in Cheat Engine to make it go away. We can run off into the distance and we find that all of these buildings are three-dimensional, most of which are textured from all sides. And if there's anywhere worth taking a look with the fog disabled, it's the frigid outskirts. Not because there's anything to really see, it's as devoid of detail as you'd probably expect, but it's nice just clearing the fog away from this annoying area. It does help reveal that the horses do just spawn out of the blue really close to you. They're not waiting from further out in the distance like the other enemies out here. Now let's experiment with going out of bounds or playing with the camera to get a closer look at some enemies. One of the coolest pieces of out of bounds content is what happens when you move up close to Nashandra. Normally when you attack her from a distance, she eventually just disappears quietly. But if you go up close and attack her, it triggers dialogue that is otherwise unused, complete with audio and subtitles.
How very dare you?
I also like being able to get a closer look at her attire while we're out here. The most interesting detail to me is her shoes. They're not depicted in this portrait of her, and you can barely see them from a distance, so I was kind of surprised to see the effort put in here. Something that Dark Souls 2 rightly gets a lot of praise for is how it made more of an effort to change things in New Game Plus than the other Souls games. There are some unique encounters, like the Duke's Dear Freya ambushing you early on in Brightstone Cove Sildora. I wanted to take the camera out behind her to see where she crawls out from, and here's what we get to see. And if we consider the level's geography, this pit is actually very near to the boss room, so it's not some huge leap that the boss could be over here. Then there's also the Executioner's Chariot. The most common way to defeat the boss is to drop the gate on it and fight the horse. But you might have noticed a pit in here, which the chariot has to jump every time it does a loop. Attacking this boss until its health is low enough, instead of dropping the gate, causes it to fall short on the jump and get stuck. And then you can knock it down like Ceaseless Discharge. But something I wondered about was whether or not the Executioner had already fallen on their own at this point, but they're actually hanging there as well. You don't actually have to go out of bounds to see it, but here's a closer look at that. We can see a flock of birds in the Forest of Fallen Giants, Huntsman's Copse, and the Earthen Peak. Taking a closer look reveals that they're entirely two-dimensional and they're just black silhouettes without any detail. And they're animated in such a way that has no regard for the direction they're facing or how they're flapping their wings. It's really quite silly to see up close. In the Forest of Fallen Giants, when you walk into the ambush set by Pate, a set of enemies comes running out at you. But getting there out of bounds can allow you to see them all standing in their original starting positions. It's nothing particularly special, but it is funny seeing them all crammed together, just standing there. I also wanted to get a closer look at the Pursuer's first entrance into the level. I played around with locking the camera angle to see exactly where the bird first spawns in, and where it leaves the level. And playing around with Cheat Engine's Monster Vac option will pull the Pursuer next to us when he first spawns in, so we can get a closer look at its pose for hanging from the bird. I similarly wanted to see where Sin, the slumbering dragon, flies off to when we first enter Sholva, and here's a look at that.
I'm called Lucatil. From the land of Mira to the far east, across the mountains.
So here's a well-known one. From Lucatil's tragic storyline, it's eventually revealed she's going hollow, and there's a point later on when you can catch a subtle glimpse of it. But from our very first encounter, we can clip the camera through her mask, and see it here as well. Here's another neat detail. Notice how she turns her head down as you approach. In addition to simply wearing a mask, this subtle behavior reflects her desire to hide her face. We can also take a closer look at Lude and Zolin before the fight starts. I have no idea if it's common knowledge or not, but Lude looks younger and healthier, while Zolin has a big scar, a broken fang, and a cataract clouding its left eye. For the Rotten, I wanted to show not a detail on the enemy itself, but how an item that can drop from it is waiting outside the boss room before it spawns in. And we might as well take a closer look at the Demon of Song before the fight starts. Normally you see it close up and stop its singing animation from a distance, but now we can enjoy it more clearly. And for this last one, it's not even out of bounds content, but I figured I'd throw it in since it's a pretty rare sight. You might have caught a glimpse of it in my most recent video, but the Looking Glass Knight has a different animation when he summons an online player instead of the usual NPC. For the NPC summon, he just slams his shield down. But when an actual player is getting pulled in, he slams his sword into the ground first as well. We can also lock the camera in order to get a new perspective on some cutscenes. This helps reveal how things often teleport around and aren't actually a seamless event, where the repositioning of camera angles normally masks all of this. Even something mundane, like entering a giant's memory, includes this. Here's another look at the character creation cutscene in Things Betwixt. We can see NPCs teleporting in and out, and even several changes to the lighting in specific moments.
What seems to be the ruckus?
Oh my, your face. The face of the curse.
It's an undead. An undead has come to play. They all end up here. All the ones like you. You spoke to that kind old dear, didn't you?
You're finished. You'll go hollow. Yes, you'll become one of them.
Hollows prey upon men, feast upon their souls. This is the fate of the cursed.
What is your name?
Plus, here's an up-close of something kind of funny in there.
Take a closer look.
Who do you think it's supposed to be?
Think back, deep into your past.
I also wanted to show some of the cutscenes from Laddersmith Gilligan. Since we all knew he had to be pulling those ladders out of nowhere, and here we can finally catch him in the act. As I mentioned earlier, there will be another discussion about Dark Souls 2's world layout at some point in the future, and I hope you're looking forward to that as well. If there's anything specific you wanted to see, or something important you felt was missing from this episode, please let me know in the comments. For some quick credits, I'd like to thank Jasper for their NoClip website and its Dark Souls 2 collision map viewer, and also Atvark and everyone who helped contribute to the Dark Souls 2 cheat engine script. If you'd like to support this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I post updates about what I'm working on, it's a good place to ask me questions directly, and there's currently a poll up to help decide the next episode for $5 backers and above. So stop on by if you'd like to help settle whether the next episode will be about Gravelording, Miracle Resonance, or Mr. Gimmick. That poll should be open for another 48 hours or so. I'm super appreciative of the amount of support so far, and an extra special thanks to Alex the Bear, Curtis Ware, Gary Marshall, Carl Germ, Mystic Referee, and The Lore Hunter. And as always, thanks again for watching.